The night their queen abandoned her own coronation, an empire realized something was terribly wrong. The sky above Aethryne had always been perfect, silent, controlled. The stars moved exactly where the astronomers predicted. The moons reflected against the crystal oceans in smooth, silver lines. Even the wind obeyed the seasonal towers built beneath the capital 3,000 years earlier. Nothing chaotic ever touched the world of Queen Lysara Vale, until the sky cracked open. It happened during the final minute of the Ascension Rite. Tens of thousands of citizens knelt in absolute silence beneath the floating palace terraces while columns of pale blue fire climbed into the clouds around the royal platform. The air smelled of rainstone and cold metal. Choir drones hovered overhead, singing in low harmonic waves that vibrated through the bones like distant thunder. Lysara stood alone at the center of the ceremony, wearing a crown made of living crystal branches that glowed faint gold against her silver-blue skin. She did not blink. She did not move. A ruler of Aethryne was trained from birth to master stillness before mastering power. Then the stars screamed. A burning object tore across the heavens so violently that the clouds split apart behind it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The object spun out of control, trailing black smoke and molten debris across nearly 40 miles of sky before slamming through the upper atmosphere hard enough to shake the palace beneath their feet. The sound arrived seconds later. Deep, heavy, wrong. The sacred choir drones instantly fell silent. Lysara looked up slowly as fire streaked across the darkness like a dying star. Her royal advisors immediately dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty," one whispered carefully. "The rite must continue." But Lysara could not look away. Something about the falling ship felt alive. Not like a weapon, not like an invasion, more like pain. The object vanished behind the western desert mountains beyond the capital walls. Seconds later, a distant flash lit the horizon. Then came the delayed shockwave. The palace windows trembled softly. Somewhere below, people screamed. The queen stepped forward. Her ceremonial robes brushed against the glowing white floor. "Prepare a recovery unit," she said quietly. The advisors froze. One of the elder counselors lifted his head in visible confusion. "Your Majesty, protocol forbids direct contact with unidentified species." Lysara kept staring toward the horizon where smoke still climbed into the night sky. Then changed the protocol. The council chamber went completely still. No ruler in modern Aethryne history had ever interrupted the Ascension right once it began. It was considered sacred law. But the queen turned away from the throne before the crown seal could even activate. The crowd below watched in stunned silence as Lysara descended the palace steps instead of ascending them. Her guards rushed to follow. Metallic capes fluttered behind them in the cold night wind, while transport carriers powered awake along the lower platforms. Somewhere far beyond the city, flames continued to rise into the dark. The journey across the desert took 23 minutes. By the time the royal convoy arrived, the crash site had transformed the valley into a field of burning wreckage stretching nearly half a mile wide. Pieces of blackened metal still glowed orange against the sand. The smell hit first. Burned circuitry, fuel vapor, heated stone. Soldiers spread outward carefully with pulse rifles raised while drones scanned the debris for movement. Lysara stepped down from the carrier into the drifting ash. Tiny particles floated through the air like black snow. "Life signs detected," one guard announced through his helmet. "Single survivor." They found him beside the ruined front section of the ship. The human was on his knees in the sand, struggling to pull another body free from collapsed wreckage even though the fires around it had already gone cold. His movements were slow, unsteady. One sleeve of his flight jacket had burned away completely, exposing skin covered in soot and shallow cuts. Blood ran down the side of his forehead. But he kept trying, kept pulling, kept whispering something under his breath. Lysara stopped walking. The soldiers tightened formation instantly. "Unknown species confirmed," the captain warned. "Possible threat." The human finally looked up. His face was exhausted, pale beneath the ash, his eyes unfocused from pain and smoke. Yet even then, he did not reach for a weapon. He looked back at the body trapped beneath the wreckage instead, and quietly said, "I'm sorry." Lysara felt something shift inside her chest. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous. Because for the first time in her entire life, The Queen of Aethryne was looking at a creature the Empire considered beneath them, and all she could see was grief. No one on Aethryne had ever seen their queen hesitate before. But that night, Queen Lysara Vale remained perfectly still beside the wreckage while ash drifted across her glowing robes, and the desert wind carried the smell of burned metal for miles. The human in front of her could barely stay upright. His breathing sounded rough, uneven. Every movement looked heavy, like his body was slowly forgetting how to stand. Yet he still kept one hand on the trapped crew member beneath the collapsed section of the ship, as if refusing to let go mattered more than his own survival. Lysara watched carefully. Her people did not grieve like this. On Aethryne, death was accepted with silence. Controlled, ordered, efficient. But this human held on to loss like it was something sacred. Step away from the wreckage, Captain Radek ordered sharply from behind the Queen. Pulse rifles remained aimed directly at the survivor. Red targeting lights moved across the human's torn jacket, while drones circled overhead in slow mechanical patterns. Unknown biology, unknown intentions. The human finally looked toward the soldiers. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. His eyes drifted briefly toward the weapons before returning to the body trapped beneath the debris. "Help me move this," he said quietly. Several guards exchanged stunned looks. The captain stepped forward instantly. "You do not issue commands here." But Lysara lifted one hand. Everything stopped. Even the drones froze in place above the crash site. The Queen stepped closer until drifting embers reflected softly across her silver-blue skin. Up close, the human looked worse than before. His face carried fresh cuts from shattered glass. Smoke stains covered most of his flight suit. One of his gloves had melted partially into the fabric around his wrist. Yet somehow his first concern had not been escape or surrender, only the dead beside him. Lysara lowered herself slowly onto one knee in the black sand. The guards behind her inhaled sharply. On Aethryne, rulers did not kneel. Not before citizens. Certainly not before strangers from another world. But the Queen ignored the shock spreading through her soldiers. "What is your name?" she asked softly. The human blinked once, almost confused by the question itself. "Callum," he answered after a moment. His voice sounded dry from smoke and exhaustion. "Callum Vey." Lysara studied him quietly. "You are injured." A faint laugh escaped him. Small, hollow. "Yeah," he murmured. "That usually happens when you fall out of the sky." For the first time in years, something unfamiliar touched the edge of the Queen's expression. Not amusement exactly. More curiosity. Human humor made no logical sense. The captain stepped closer again, visibly tense. "Your Majesty, this is unsafe. We should detain the survivor immediately." Callum slowly released the wreckage behind him, his strength finally giving out. The moment he tried to stand, his knees nearly collapsed beneath him. Without thinking, Lysara reached forward and caught his arm before he hit the sand. Silence swallowed the valley. Every soldier froze. Every drone camera shifted toward the Queen. Her glowing fingers rested against the burned fabric of his sleeve, while Callum stared at her in visible disbelief. Alien skin was cool against his arm, smooth like polished stone beneath moonlight. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Callum glanced around at the weapons aimed toward him and quietly asked, "Am I your prisoner?" Lysara looked directly into his exhausted eyes. "No," she answered. "You are under my protection." The captain immediately protested. "Your Majesty, imperial law forbids direct royal sanctuary for unidentified species." Lysara rose slowly to her feet beside the human. Her robes moved softly through the drifting ash while the desert fires reflected gold against the crystal crown above her head. "Then imperial law," she said calmly, "will adapt." The soldiers fell silent again, not because they agreed, because no one had ever heard the Queen challenge sacred law before. Callum swayed slightly from exhaustion beside her. His gaze drifted once more toward the wreckage where his crew remained trapped beneath twisted metal and fading firelight. Lysara noticed immediately. "You wish to stay with them," she said quietly. He swallowed hard before answering. "Nobody should die alone." The Queen turned toward the burning remains of the ship while cold desert wind moved through the valley around them. Somewhere high above, the stars of Aethryne glowed silently over the crash site. Ancient, distant, watching. And for the first time in her carefully ordered life, Queen Lysara Vale began to wonder if her people had misunderstood strength all along. The ride back to the capital felt quieter than space itself. Callum sat inside the rear medical carrier while pale blue lights moved softly across the ceiling above him in slow patterns that reminded him of deep ocean water back on Earth. Every surface inside the alien transport curved smoothly without visible seams or bolts. No rattling engines. No vibration beneath the floor. Just silence. The kind of silence expensive machines made when civilizations became too advanced to sound mechanical anymore. He hated it immediately. Human ships were never this quiet. Human ships hummed, groaned, complained. They sounded alive. Across from him, two royal guards stood perfectly still in silver armor that reflected the dim cabin lights like mirrors. Neither had spoken during the entire 40-minute flight. They only watched him carefully with glowing eyes behind translucent visors while strange symbols moved across the inside of their helmets. Callum leaned his head back against the cold wall and closed his eyes for a second. The pain in his ribs had started getting worse. Every breath felt tight. Somewhere beneath the dried blood on his sleeve, his wrist trembled from exhaustion. But none of that stayed in his mind for long. He could still see the wreckage burning in the desert. Still hear the sound of twisted metal settling into the sand behind him while his crew remained there beneath the stars. You should rest. The voice came from the opposite side of the cabin. Calm. Controlled. Callum opened his eyes again. Queen Lasara sat several feet away near the forward window of the carrier. Her ceremonial robes had been replaced with a darker silver garment lined with faint glowing patterns near the sleeves. Without the crown lights surrounding her now, she looked less like a ruler and more like something ancient carved from moonlight and stone. She had been silent for most of the flight, staring out toward the desert below while distant city lights slowly appeared along the horizon. Callum shifted carefully in his seat. Hard to sleep after crashing onto another planet. Lasara turned slightly toward him. You speak lightly for someone who has lost much tonight. He stared at the floor for a moment before answering. If I stop joking about bad situations, it usually means I am in real trouble. Something almost resembling confusion touched her expression. Humans use humor to soften pain? Sometimes. He shrugged weakly. Sometimes we use it because pain is already there anyway. The Queen studied him quietly after that. Not judging, not analyzing, just watching, as if she had discovered a language she could almost understand but not fully speak yet. Outside the transport windows, the capital of Aethryne finally came into view. Callum slowly sat forward despite the pain in his chest. The city looked impossible. Towers of white crystal stretched thousands of feet into the air beneath floating rings of light that rotated silently above the skyline. Bridges curved through the air without visible support structures, while streams of glowing vehicles moved between them like rivers of stars. The entire city shimmered silver and blue beneath the night sky. Jesus, he whispered under his breath. Lasara tilted her head slightly. Your reaction suggests surprise. Lady, my apartment back home had a leaking ceiling and a broken microwave. That unfamiliar flicker touched her eyes again. Not quite amusement, but close. The carrier descended toward the palace district at the center of the city. As they approached, Callum noticed something strange. Every transport in the sky moved aside for them instantly. Entire traffic lanes cleared within seconds. Citizens on elevated walkways stopped walking and lowered their heads as the royal carrier passed overhead. They are bowing to you, Callum said quietly. They are acknowledging the crown, Lasara corrected softly. He looked back toward her. What is the difference? For the first time since the crash, the Queen hesitated before answering. I am no longer certain. The transport landed inside a massive circular chamber lined with glowing pillars nearly 100 feet tall. The doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh. Rows of guards already waited outside in complete silence. The moment Lasara stepped onto the platform, every soldier lowered themselves to one knee simultaneously. Callum froze beside the carrier doorway. The movement happened with such precision it looked rehearsed for years. No one looked directly at the Queen. No one spoke above a whisper. Then he noticed the symbols carved into the floor beneath her feet. Royal insignias, crown marks, ceremonial pathways. His stomach tightened slightly. Back at the crash site, covered in ash and desert firelight, she had looked almost ordinary beside him. But here, she looked untouchable. Ancient. Dangerous. One of the guards approached carefully and lowered his head. "Your Majesty," he said formally. "The High Council has already assembled." Callum slowly turned toward Lysara. "Wait," he said quietly. "You are not just some governor or military commander." The queen met his gaze calmly beneath the towering palace lights. "No," she answered. "I am the ruler of Aethryne." Silence settled heavily between them. Callum looked around at the kneeling soldiers, the endless palace corridors, the glowing royal insignias beneath their feet. Then back at the woman who had knelt beside him in the ashes like none of this power mattered at all. And for the second time that night, Callum Vey realized he had absolutely no idea what kind of world he had fallen into. The palace corridors never truly slept. Even near midnight, soft streams of silver light moved beneath the glass floors while distant transport rails hummed somewhere deep below the structure like the heartbeat of a living machine. Callum walked carefully beside two royal guards through a hallway large enough to fit an aircraft hangar back on Earth. Every step echoed faintly against polished crystal walls that reflected his damaged flight jacket from 100 different angles. He looked like a man who did not belong there. Because he did not. The guards finally stopped outside a circular chamber lined with glowing symbols that shifted slowly across the walls like moving constellations. One of them pressed a hand against the doorway. The seal opened soundlessly. "Medical restoration chamber," the guard said without emotion. "You will remain here until the High Council decides your status." Callum glanced inside. The room looked less like a hospital and more like a luxury hotel designed by people who had never experienced discomfort before in their lives. Smooth white furniture curved naturally from the walls themselves. Thin streams of blue water moved beneath transparent flooring. The air smelled faintly of rain and cold stone. "Status," Callum repeated quietly. That is usually not a comforting word. Neither guard responded. The doorway closed behind him a second later. Alone at last, Callum exhaled slowly and sat down on the edge of the nearest platform bed. The silence felt heavier now. No alarms. No burning wreckage. No screaming metal. Just the memory of it. He rubbed both hands across his face and stared at the floor for a long moment. Somewhere out there, the remains of his crew were still cooling beneath alien stars. He should have died with them. Instead, he was standing inside a palace on another planet wearing borrowed medical wraps around his burned arm, while alien royalty argued about whether he was dangerous. The thought almost made him laugh. A soft tone interrupted the silence. One section of the wall illuminated instantly as symbols flowed across its surface. Then a calm, artificial voice spoke in perfect English. Atmospheric oxygen adjusted for human respiratory comfort. Callum blinked slowly. "Well, that is terrifying." Another pause. Clarification requested. He stared at the glowing wall for a second before shaking his head. "Never mind." The room fell silent again. Callum leaned back carefully and closed his eyes. He only meant to rest for a minute. But exhaustion pulled him under almost immediately. When he woke again, the room lighting had dimmed into softer shades of blue. He did not know how long he had been asleep. Minutes maybe. Hours. Somewhere nearby, rain tapped gently against glass. Real rain this time. Not machine condensation. Callum sat up slowly. His ribs still hurt, but less than before. Someone had cleaned and treated the injuries on his arm while he slept. Fresh bandages wrapped neatly around his wrist now. Human-style stitching too. Precise. Functional. He frowned slightly. Then he noticed movement near the far side of the chamber. Queen Lysara stood alone beside the curved window overlooking the city below. No guards. No advisors. Her silver robes reflected the distant lights of the capital while rain streaked softly down the glass behind her. She had probably been standing there for some time already. "You move quietly," Callum muttered. Lysara turned toward him calmly. "You were exhausted." "Still am." He swung his legs carefully off the bed. "How long was I out?" "Nearly 6 hours." He stared at her for a moment. "And you stayed here?" "Partially." That answer sounded strangely honest. Callum stood slowly and walked toward the window beside her. The city beneath the palace looked different during rainfall. The crystal towers glowed softer now. Almost warm. Streams of hovering traffic reflected through the mist like rivers of moving stars. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Lysara broke the silence quietly. "Your vessel was not military." "No, a research ship?" Callum nodded once. "Long-range survey crew." His voice lowered slightly after that. 8 people. The queen watched the rain beyond the glass. You attempted to save them even after impact survival became statistically impossible. Callum folded his arms carefully against the ache in his ribs. You keep saying things like statistics matter during moments like that. Do they not? He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The calm posture. The perfect control in every movement. The queen carried herself like someone raised to never reveal uncertainty. Yet beneath that control, something in her eyes seemed different tonight. Curious. Searching. Back home, Callum said quietly. People stay with each other because leaving feels worse. Lysara remained silent. He continued softly. You do not walk away from people you care about just because the odds are bad. Rain continued sliding down the palace glass between them. Somewhere below, thunder rolled gently across the distant skyline. The queen lowered her gaze slightly. On Aethryne, she said at last, attachment often weakens judgment. Callum gave a tired half-smile. Yeah, humans are pretty bad at separating emotions from decisions. Another long silence settled over the room. Then Lysara asked something so quietly he almost missed it. And yet, would your species survive without them? Callum did not answer immediately, because suddenly he understood something strange about the Queen of Aethryne. For all her power, for all the towering cities and advanced machines and endless ceremony surrounding her, Lysara Vale sounded like someone asking what it felt like to be human. 3 days after the crash, Callum finally stopped feeling like a prisoner and started feeling something far more dangerous. Comfortable. The realization hit him while standing alone inside one of the lower engineering corridors beneath the palace, where warm air moved through massive ventilation chambers lined with glowing conduits thicker than train tunnels back on Earth. He should not have been there. Technically, he was still under royal supervision. But the guards assigned to him had slowly relaxed once they realized the strange human spent more time fixing broken maintenance panels than trying to escape. Callum crouched beside an open-access port with a repair tool in one hand while blue sparks flickered softly against his tired face. There, he muttered under his breath as the damaged relay finally powered back online. A low mechanical hum rolled through the corridor a second later. Overhead lights stabilized instantly. Somewhere deeper in the structure, heavy turbines restarted with a smooth vibration beneath the floor. One of the nearby workers stared at him in disbelief. The alien technician had 6 thin fingers and silver markings across the side of his face that brightened slightly with surprise. That system has been unstable for 11 cycles, the worker said carefully. Callum wiped grease across the side of his pants. Yeah, well, somebody wired the thermal routing backwards. The technician blinked twice. You understood our infrastructure? Not really. Callum shrugged. Machines complain the same way everywhere. More workers slowly gathered nearby after that. Curious, cautious, watching the human who spoke casually to royal engineers while kneeling on the floor covered in oil stains like he belonged there. Most citizens inside the palace avoided direct eye contact with the queen. But somehow this exhausted man from another world treated everyone exactly the same. Workers, guards, servants. It confused them. Above the corridor entrance, unnoticed by nearly everyone below, Queen Lysara stood silently on an elevated observation walkway overlooking the engineering level. She had arrived nearly 10 minutes earlier after receiving reports that the human guest had disappeared from his assigned quarters again. Her advisors expected recklessness. Sabotage, perhaps. Instead, she found Callum repairing failing systems beside palace laborers who ranked among the lowest social tiers in Aethryne society. No one from the royal class had walked these maintenance halls in years. Lysara rested one hand lightly against the glass railing while watching him below. He laughed quietly at something one of the workers said. The sound surprised her more than it should have. Humans expressed emotion so openly, so freely. On Aethryne, composure was strength. Emotion belonged behind walls. Yet Callum moved through the world without those walls at all. One of the engineers handed him a data tablet displaying thermal fluctuations from the lower power grid. Callum studied it for a moment before pointing toward a nearby energy line. Your cooling loop keeps overcorrecting by nearly 4%, he explained. The system is compensating too aggressively every time demand spikes. The workers listened carefully, not because he held authority, because he was helping. Lysara noticed something else then. None of them bowed to him. None feared him. And somehow that made them stand closer. The Queen remained hidden above while Callum climbed onto the side of another maintenance platform to reach a damaged panel nearly 12 feet overhead. "You should not do that yourself," one worker warned. "Your injuries remain unresolved." "Back home," Callum replied while adjusting the panel carefully. "We call this job security." A few of the workers exchanged confused looks again. Then one of them laughed, quietly despite clearly not understanding the phrase. Lasara felt that strange sensation return inside her chest. Warmth. Not physical. Something else. Something she had no training for. Her people respected perfection. Efficiency. Distance. But the human below inspired something entirely different. Ease. The repair platform suddenly sparked brighter than expected. Callum lost his footing slightly before catching himself against the support rail. Several workers rushed forward immediately. Concern spread through the corridor in seconds. "I am fine," he said quickly, steadying himself. "Just bruised my ego a little." Again the workers looked confused. Again they laughed anyway. Lasara lowered her eyes briefly. On Aethryne, rulers maintained order through precision and fear of failure. But this human built connection through imperfection, through mistakes, through kindness so casual it almost looked accidental. She remained there silently for several more minutes, while Callum continued working beside the labor crews beneath the glowing palace machinery. Then her chief advisor appeared quietly behind her on the observation platform. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. The High Council grows increasingly concerned. Lasara did not look away from the corridor below. Concerned by what? By him. The advisor lowered his voice slightly. "The palace workers have begun referring to the human by name." That finally made Lasara turn. "And why is that dangerous?" The advisor hesitated. "Because they do not speak his name with fear." Silence settled between them. Below, Callum handed a repair tool back to one of the workers while explaining something about pressure valves with grease still smeared across his bandaged hands. Lasara watched him for another long moment before speaking softly enough that only the advisor could hear. "Perhaps," the Queen said quietly, "fear is not the only way a civilization survives." The summons arrived just before dawn. Callum found the message waiting outside his chamber on a thin silver tablet glowing softly against the floor. No guards. No explanation. Only a single line written in clean translated English. "The High Council requests your presence immediately." He stared at the words for several seconds while pale morning light slowly spread across the palace skyline beyond his window. Somewhere below, the city of Aethryne was beginning another perfectly ordered day. Streams of aerial traffic moved between crystal towers with mathematical precision. Weather control satellites shifted the cloud cover into smooth silver layers above the capital. Everything on this world operated exactly as intended. Everything except him. 40 minutes later, Callum walked alone through the central council corridor wearing a dark formal jacket provided by palace attendants who clearly had no idea how human clothing sizes worked. The sleeve set slightly too long. The collar pressed awkwardly against his neck. He looked uncomfortable enough that several passing servants quietly lowered their eyes to hide amusement. At least that emotion translated universally. Massive doors opened ahead of him without sound. The council chamber stretched nearly 200 feet wide beneath a domed ceiling filled with slowly rotating stars projected across black glass. 12 elevated platforms circled the room. On each platform sat one member of the High Council dressed in layered ceremonial silver robes that shimmered faintly under the chamber lights. None of them smiled. At the center of the room stood Queen Lasara Vale. Alone. Still. Her expression unreadable beneath the pale glow surrounding the throne platform behind her. Callum immediately noticed something different. She was not standing on the throne level itself. She stood several steps below it, deliberately separated from the seat of power. One of the counselors leaned forward slowly as Callum approached. Elder Verex. Thin, sharp-featured, eyes cold as polished stone. "Human," he said calmly. "You have become a subject of concern within this palace." Callum stopped several feet from the center platform. "That usually means I accidentally fixed something important." No one laughed. Lasara lowered her gaze slightly, though Callum noticed the faintest shift near the corner of her expression. Elder Verex continued. "You have interacted directly with labor castes, engineering sectors, civilian workers." "Yeah." Callum nodded once. "They seem nice." Another counselor spoke next. You have also disrupted social hierarchy protocols. I repaired a coolant system. Exactly. Silence spread through the chamber again. Callum looked slowly between them, then toward Lysara. Okay, he said carefully. I feel like I missed several chapters of cultural context here. Elder Varex rose slowly from his platform. On Aethryne, every citizen understands their place within the structure of civilization. Order preserves unity. Distance preserves respect. His glowing eyes narrowed slightly. Compassion without hierarchy creates instability. Callum stared at him for a second. That might be the saddest sentence I have ever heard. Several council members shifted visibly at the response. One of them looked almost offended by the idea itself. Elder Varex remained perfectly composed. Your presence already alters behavioral patterns within the palace. Workers speak your name openly. Guards have begun addressing you conversationally rather than ceremonially. So, the elder replied coldly. Familiarity weakens authority. Callum glanced toward Lysara again. And everybody here believes that? The chamber remained silent. Then, quietly, the queen answered. It is the foundation upon which Aethryne was built. Her voice carried no anger, only honesty. Callum exhaled slowly and folded his arms. Back on Earth, people usually trust leaders more when they act like actual people. That statement created immediate tension throughout the room. Several counselors exchanged sharp looks. One finally spoke with visible disbelief. Your species allows emotional equality between rulers and civilians? Most of the time we complain about our leaders constantly, Callum admitted. That is considered healthy. A few council members looked genuinely disturbed now. Elder Varex turned toward the queen directly. Your Majesty, this conversation demonstrates the exact danger we warned about. Humanity spreads emotional disorder. Their species prioritizes attachment over structure. Individual feeling over collective stability. Lysara remained motionless at the center of the chamber, while the projected stars slowly rotated across the ceiling above them. And yet, she said softly, their civilizations endure. At enormous cost, Varex answered immediately. Humans grieve. Humans rage. Humans divide themselves endlessly through emotional impulse. His gaze shifted back toward Callum. Your species suffers because it cannot separate logic from feeling. For a moment, Callum said nothing. Then he looked directly at the elder and spoke more quietly than before. No, he said. We suffer because we care about each other enough to hurt when things go wrong. The chamber fell completely still. Even the ambient mechanical sounds beneath the floor seemed distant now. Callum continued carefully. You think emotions weaken people because they create pain. But pain is usually proof that something mattered. Elder Varex stared at him with visible disapproval. And what has that philosophy earned humanity? Callum thought about the burning wreckage beneath the desert stars. The crew he could not save. The people he still remembered anyway. Then he answered honestly. Each other. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Real. Across the chamber, Queen Lysara slowly lowered her eyes for the briefest moment as though those two words had reached somewhere inside her no ceremony or law ever had. And for the first time since the human arrived on Aethryne, several members of the High Council began looking at their queen with something dangerously close to fear. By the end of the week, the entire palace knew the human was leaving. Nobody announced it publicly. Nobody needed to. On Aethryne, tension moved quietly through rooms long before words ever followed. Servants stopped speaking when Callum entered certain corridors. Royal guards watched him differently now. Less curiosity, more caution. The warmth that had slowly begun growing around his presence inside the palace had become something dangerous. Not because he threatened anyone, because people had started changing around him. Callum understood at the moment he walked into the lower engineering hall and noticed workers standing closer together during their meal break instead of eating separately by assigned caste rank. They were laughing, talking openly, sharing tools without formal authorization protocols. One worker even greeted him by name in front of a supervisor. That single moment made the entire corridor fall silent afterward. Later that evening, Callum sat alone near one of the palace observation gardens overlooking the western edge of the city while cold wind moved softly through silver, hanging vines above him. Far below, the lights of Aethryne stretched for miles beneath the dark horizon like constellations trapped beneath glass. He held a small metal component in his hands from the wreckage of his ship. the only piece he had managed to recover personally from the crash site. Part of the navigation array, burned around the edges. Worthless now except as memory. Footsteps approached quietly behind him. He already knew who it was before she spoke. You have been avoiding the palace workers today. Lysara's voice carried softly through the night air. Callum stared out over the city, trying to avoid getting them in trouble. The queen moved beside him near the edge of the observation platform. Tonight she wore no ceremonial robes, only a dark silver coat lined with faint blue light near the collar. Simpler than usual, almost ordinary by royal standards. The council believes your influence destabilizes social order, she said carefully. Callum let out a quiet breath through his nose. Honestly, where I come from, helping people fix plumbing would not usually count as political rebellion. Lysara studied him silently for a moment. You make individuals feel seen. He looked toward her then. Is that rare here? The queen did not answer immediately. Somewhere above them, aerial transports drifted silently between the upper towers while distant rain clouds reflected pale moonlight across the city. Finally she spoke. Aethryne was built after centuries of civil collapse. Emotion became associated with disorder. Attachment became associated with weakness. Her eyes lowered slightly toward the glowing skyline below. Control created survival. Callum leaned back against the railing. Yeah, but eventually survival stops meaning much if nobody actually feels alive anymore. Those words lingered between them longer than either expected. Lysara turned toward the city again without speaking. For the first time since Callum met her, she looked tired. Not physically, something deeper than that. The exhaustion of someone who had spent an entire lifetime carrying expectations heavy enough to reshape who they were allowed to become. The council has demanded a formal judgment, she said at last. Regarding me? Regarding us. Callum frowned slightly. The queen continued carefully. They believe your continued presence threatens imperial structure. They believe my protection of you threatens the throne itself. Silence settled over the observation deck. Cold wind moved gently through the hanging silver vines above them, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Callum looked back down at the burn navigation component resting in his hand. Then he laughed softly once. Not because anything felt funny, because suddenly the entire situation felt painfully familiar. Everywhere humans go, he murmured, we accidentally become a problem. Lysara studied him quietly. You say that as though you blame yourself. Comes with the job description. He slipped the damaged component into his pocket and straightened slowly. You saved me, Lysara. But if keeping me here costs you your world. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. The queen's expression sharpened slightly at the sound of her name, spoken without title. Not offended, just surprised. Callum noticed immediately. Sorry, he said quickly, still getting used to the whole queen thing. But Lysara shook her head once. No one has addressed me that way in many years. The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. He stared at her quietly beneath the silver garden lights. That seems lonely. Something shifted behind her eyes then. Small, fragile, almost invisible, yet real enough that Callum noticed immediately. Loneliness, the queen said softly, is considered acceptable sacrifice for leadership. He shook his head. Back home we usually call that a warning sign. For a second, silence returned again. Then palace alarms suddenly echoed faintly across the distant upper towers. Low mechanical tones rolled through the night air, while streams of transport traffic abruptly changed direction overhead. Lysara's expression changed instantly. Controlled. Alert. A royal guard appeared at the far entrance of the observation platform moments later and dropped to one knee. Your Majesty, he said carefully. The High Council has initiated emergency assembly procedures. Callum felt his stomach tighten immediately. The guard hesitated before continuing. They are requesting authorization for immediate human containment protocols. The night air seemed colder after that. Neither Callum nor Lysara spoke for several seconds. Then the queen slowly turned toward the glowing skyline of her empire beneath the storm-dark sky, while distant alarm tones continued echoing through the city she had ruled her entire life. And for the first time since her coronation began, Queen Lysara Vale looked like someone standing on the edge of losing everything. The emergency assembly chamber looked colder than usual, not because of temperature, because fear had finally entered the room. Callum stood alone at the center platform beneath towering rings of white light, while dozens of council officials filled the surrounding levels in absolute silence. No workers, no servants, no citizens allowed inside. Only power, only judgment. Above them all, the great glass ceiling of the chamber reflected storm clouds rolling across the night sky over Aethryne. Rain tapped softly against the crystal dome high overhead like distant static. Queen Lysara stood before the throne platform once again, but tonight she wore the full, ceremonial crown of the Empire. Silver crystal branches curved around her head like frozen lightning, while the royal mantle flowed behind her in long, glowing lines across the chamber floor. She looked untouchable again. That frightened Callum more than the guards surrounding him. Elder Verex rose slowly from the council tier. "Human Callum Vey," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You stand accused of destabilizing imperial hierarchy, corrupting caste protocol, and influencing the sovereign crown through emotional manipulation." Callum blinked once. "That is honestly the most dramatic description anyone has ever given me." No one reacted, not even Lysara. The elder continued. "Your presence has already altered labor division patterns across the capital. Workers now gather without authorization. Guards speak informally during duty cycles. Civilian interaction compliance has declined by 17% in 6 days." Callum glanced sideways toward the queen. "You people really track conversations?" "Order requires observation," Verex answered coldly. "And humanity spreads disorder wherever it travels." Silence settled heavily afterward. Then the elder turned toward Lysara directly. "Your Majesty, imperial law permits only 2 resolutions under these circumstances." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as ceremonial symbols illuminated across the floor beneath the throne. The human will either be permanently contained beneath royal authority or removed from Aethryne entirely. Several guards tightened their grip on their weapons after the words left his mouth. Callum felt it immediately. The shift in atmosphere. This was no longer political theater. They had already decided what they wanted. Lysara remained perfectly still at the center of the chamber. "And if I refuse both options?" she asked quietly. Elder Verex lowered his head slightly. "Then the council will interpret continued protection of the human as abandonment of sovereign neutrality." Callum slowly exhaled through his nose. There it was. The real threat. Not against him. Against her. He looked around the chamber at the glowing council tiers rising into darkness above them. Entire civilizations could probably collapse inside rooms like this while everyone still spoke politely. The elder continued carefully. "A ruler must remain above emotional compromise. That principle preserved this empire for centuries." Finally, Lysara spoke again. "And what if the principle itself is flawed?" The question moved through the chamber like a shockwave. Several council members visibly stiffened. One actually looked stunned enough to speak out of turn. "Your Majesty," the counselor whispered, "please reconsider these statements." But Lysara stepped forward instead. Slowly, deliberately. The glowing train of her royal mantle drifted across the chamber floor behind her, while thunder rolled softly above the glass ceiling. "For generations," she said calmly, "Aethryne believed dignity required distance. We taught ourselves that compassion weakened authority, that emotion threatened civilization." Her eyes shifted toward Callum briefly before returning to the council. "And yet a single human crash-landed onto our world carrying more grief for others than fear for himself. No one moved. No one interrupted. He repaired systems no one asked him to repair. He spoke to workers no rulers bothered to see. He treated lives without rank as though they still possessed value." Her voice lowered slightly after that. "And all of you call this dangerous." Elder Verex stepped forward sharply. "Because it is dangerous." The elder's voice echoed harder now. "Humanity survives through emotional chaos. Attachment. Instability. Their kindness creates dependency. Their grief clouds judgment." Callum finally spoke up quietly from the center platform. "You keep talking about emotions like they are a disease." Verex turned toward him immediately. "And what would you call the collapse of order spreading through this city?" Callum looked around the chamber slowly before answering. "Maybe people are just tired of being treated like machinery." Several council members reacted visibly to that. Offended, uncomfortable, afraid. The elder raised one trembling hand toward the throne. "Your Majesty, if the human remains, your authority itself may fracture." Silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the royal guards standing near the lower chamber entrance slowly removed his helmet. Everyone turned immediately. The young guard lowered himself onto one knee before the throne. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he said carefully, "but the human repaired my brother's medical transport line 3 days ago without being asked." The chamber froze completely. Another voice spoke from the upper tier, one of the engineering supervisors. "He restored heating systems in the labor district." Then another. "He stayed with injured workers during the storm blackout." More voices followed after that. Quiet at first, then stronger. Not rebellion. Something stranger. Gratitude. Elder Varex stared around the chamber in visible disbelief, while citizens of Aethryne broke centuries of silence simply to speak the human's name aloud. And in the middle of that impossible moment, Queen Lysara Vale finally understood the truth her empire had feared all along. Humanity was not dangerous because it conquered worlds. Humanity was dangerous because it reminded people they deserved to feel human too. Rain continued falling over Aethryne long after the council chamber emptied. The storm moved slowly across the capital during the night, washing silver light through the towering crystal skyline, while thunder echoed softly between the upper spires like distant drums fading into memory. By morning, the city felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just awake in a way Callum had not noticed before. Workers spoke openly in transit corridors now. Guards nodded to laborers instead of staring past them. Small things. Human things. The kind of changes powerful societies never noticed until they became impossible to reverse. Callum stood alone on one of the western palace terraces watching sunrise spill across the mountains beyond the city. The repaired navigation component from his ship rested quietly in his hand, while cold wind moved through the collar of his dark jacket. Below him, aerial traffic drifted through the glowing skyline in calm streams of blue and silver light. Somewhere beneath all of it, an empire was trying to decide what kind of future it wanted to become. Footsteps approached behind him. Slow. Familiar. He smiled faintly before turning around. Lysara stopped beside him near the terrace edge, her silver robes moving softly in the morning wind. For once, she wore no crown at all. Without it, she looked younger somehow. Less distant. More real. They stood beside each other quietly for several seconds while sunlight slowly reached the upper towers of the capital. "The council accepted your release terms," she said at last. Callum nodded once. "Figured they would rather send me away than keep causing heart attacks." A faint breath escaped her. Not quite laughter, but closer than before. "You joke when facing loss. Occupational hazard." His smile faded gently after that. "The transport leaves today?" At midday. Silence returned between them. Somewhere below the terrace, bells rang softly through the city, signaling the beginning of the morning cycle. Callum rested both hands against the smooth crystal railing and stared toward the horizon. "I never meant to disrupt your world." Lysara looked at him carefully. "You repaired what was already breaking." Those words settled heavily between them. Callum lowered his eyes briefly toward the navigation component still resting in his palm. "Back on Earth," he said quietly. "Most people who try to change systems like this usually get crushed by them." The Queen watched the sunrise reflect across the city below. Perhaps that is why humanity fascinates the stars. He turned slightly toward her. "What does that mean?" Lysara's glowing eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Most civilizations eventually choose comfort over compassion, stability over dignity. Your species continues choosing each other even when it causes pain." Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. "That is rare." Callum did not know how to answer that. So instead, he looked out over Aethryne beside her while cold morning wind moved between them carrying the scent of rain and distant metal. After a long silence, Lysara spoke again. "There is something else you should see before you leave." 30 minutes later, they stood together inside the lower memorial district near the center of the capital where workers and civilians rarely saw royalty in person. Massive stone arches curved overhead, while water flowed quietly through narrow channels beneath the walkway floors. Citizens stopped in stunned silence as the Queen passed among them without guards or ceremony. But Lysara never slowed. At the center of the district stood a newly constructed monument still surrounded by maintenance drones and unfinished lighting systems. Callum froze the moment he saw it. The statue was not of a king, not of a battle, not of conquest. It showed two figures instead, one kneeling, One rising. The alien figure wore no crown. The human figure wore no armor. Their hands simply reached toward each other in the middle of helping someone stand. Callum stared at the monument speechlessly while workers nearby pretended not to watch his reaction. "You built this overnight?" he asked finally. Lasara folded her hands calmly before her. "No." She looked toward the workers standing around the memorial plaza. They did. For several seconds, Callum could not speak at all, because suddenly he understood what frightened the council most. Humanity had not changed Aethryne through force, or technology, or war. It changed them through permission. Permission to care openly. Permission to kneel without shame. Permission to see each other as more than function and hierarchy and status. A small child near the edge of the plaza suddenly stepped forward from beside her mother, holding a single silver flower. She looked nervous, tiny compared to the towering palace structures surrounding the district. Slowly, she walked toward Callum and held the flower out with both hands. "For the Sky Traveler," she whispered softly. Callum accepted it carefully. "Thank you." The child smiled before running back toward her family, while nearby workers quietly pretended not to wipe moisture from their eyes. Callum looked down at the silver flower in his hand for a long moment. Then toward Lasara. "You know," he murmured, "back home, this would probably be the part where somebody gives an inspiring speech." The queen tilted her head slightly. "And will you?" He looked around the memorial plaza. The workers. The citizens. The city slowly waking beneath the morning light. Then he shook his head once. "No," he said softly. "I think they already understand." Lasara followed his gaze across the people gathered around the monument. No one bowed anymore. Not out here. Not today. They simply stood together beneath the morning sky, while sunlight reflected across the crystal towers of Aethryne for the first time in centuries without feeling cold. And as the wind moved gently through the memorial plaza, Queen Lasara Vale finally realized the most dangerous thing the human had brought to her world was never rebellion. It was hope. Thank you for watching until the end. Watch the full story in the comments and video description. Like and subscribe to the channel to see more interesting content.